But it has trillions of atoms and molecules in here. They're all moving around, bouncing against each other at incredibly high speeds. That's computation. That's not very useful today. It's organized kind of randomly. We can't communicate with it very well. But we're going to change that. We're going to reorganize the vast amount of computation in this rock to make it useful. And it won't just be raw computation. We'll infuse it with exquisitely intelligent software, vastly greater than our intelligence today, and with all the knowledge of the human-machine civilization. This rock is going to be a trillion times more powerful than all biological human brains today. This is going to be quite a valuable rock. We call matter and energy reorganized in this way computronium. We're going to reach these limits late in this century, and at that time, we're going to turn many of the rocks and other stuff suitable for computation into computronium. And so, to keep the expansion of our intelligence going, we will then need to spread out to the rest of the universe, turning some portion of it into computronium. How fast can we do this? That depends on whether or not we can transcend or otherwise get around the speed of light as a limit. There are suggestions that there may be subtle ways of doing this. One possibility is to send intelligent nanobots through wormholes, which are basically shortcuts to apparently faraway places through other spatial dimensions beyond the three we're familiar with. Wormholes through space appear to be consistent with our understanding of physics. If it is indeed feasible to either find or build such wormholes, our intelligence will be so great that we'll be capable of engineering these shortcuts to reach other parts of the universe in brief periods of time. In that case, we could infuse the universe with our intelligence rather quickly. It would require only another century, that is by the end of the 22nd century, to saturate the universe with computronium. On the other hand, if we can't get around the speed of light, it'll take a lot longer. But in either case, expanding our intelligence throughout the universe is our ultimate destiny. Cosmologists today argue about whether the universe will die in fire or ice. Fire means a big hot crunch, basically the opposite of the Big Bang. Ice means stars flying apart, eventually dying out. Both of these views of cosmology assume that intelligence has nothing to do with it, that intelligence is just a bit of entertaining froth that dances in and out of the dumb celestial forces that rule the universe. But this perspective ignores the law of accelerating returns. As a result of the exponential expansion of our knowledge and skill, the universe will ultimately be infused with computronium and with the vast intelligence of our human-machine civilization. So the universe will wake up, and we will intelligently decide its fate.
And above all else, you are known for being one of the world's foremost futurists. You have a startling good track record of predictions. I think you're, what, 86%? Is that where you put yourself?
An analysis of 147 predictions I made in The Age of Spiritual Machines, which came out in '99, about 2009, were 86% correct.
All right, not bad, not bad. And what's getting the most attention lately is that you have predicted that in 2029, we're going to pass, the machines will pass the Turing test, and in 2045, we will achieve the singularity, at which point human intelligence melds with machine intelligence.
Yeah, I've been consistent on 2029 for computers passing the Turing test, which I think is a valid test. There's no sort of simple language tricks you can deploy to pass a valid Turing test, with emphasis on the word valid. When I made that prediction in The Age of Spiritual Machines in '99, Stanford had a conference and on AI experts to assess this startling prediction, and we took a poll. The consensus was hundreds of years. 25% thought it would never happen. My view and the consensus of AI experts has been getting closer together, but I haven't been changing my view.
All right.
2006 at a conference, AI 50, on the 50th anniversary of the 1956 conference at Dartmouth that gave artificial intelligence its name. The consensus was 50 years. Recent polls, the medians are 20 to 30 years. I'm still a little bit more optimistic, but there's maybe 25% who think I'm too conservative. And the pace of progress, just in recent months, has been quite startling. We can talk about that.
So let's talk about the pace of progress and the acceleration of ideas, which is what we are here to discuss. I want to talk about, first and foremost, the allocation of resources. This is all moving exponentially fast, and I would like to know what you think about managing access and talent and finances such that this progress can be maximized for social good.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I go around the world, people genuinely feel things are getting worse. And I think that's because our information about what's wrong with the world, including violence and poverty and environmental degradation, is getting exponentially better. I have all kinds of graphs. Poverty has fallen over 90% in the last 20 years in Asia and comparably in other parts of the world. Solar energy is doubling every 2 years. It's only 5 or 6 doublings from meeting 100% of our energy needs, at which point it'll be using 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight that falls on the earth. Literacy went from 10% to 90% in the world over the last century. Every aspect of human well-being is getting dramatically better. And we're going to see dramatic advances in longevity very soon, now that biotechnology, which is really reprogramming the software of life, is getting traction. We have a trickle of instances today that'll become a flood over the next decade. This is the most peaceful time in human history. People think I'm nuts when I say that. Didn't you pay attention to the incident yesterday and the week before? But that's because, you know, a century ago, the village nearby could have been wiped out and you wouldn't hear about it for months. We have more information about what's wrong with the world, and we have an evolutionary preference for bad news because it was actually good for survival. The little rustling in the leaves, it might be a predator. It was very important that you pay attention to that. The fact that your crops were 1% better than last year was not so important for survival. So we tend to pay attention to bad news. We find it more interesting anyway. That's what's served up to us. People's algorithm for whether the world's getting better or worse, it's how often do they hear good news versus bad news, and that's really not a very good algorithm.
So, bad news. Let's talk about that. Self-fulfilling prophecy here. Elon Musk was at the festival a couple days ago, and he was doing a Q&A, and he said, and I quote, "Mark my words, AI is more dangerous than nukes."
Well, I've been accused of being an optimist, and I am optimistic that we'll make it through these new existential risks. You have to be an optimist to be an entrepreneur. But I've actually spoken more about the risks of these new information technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology, than most others. I started writing about it actually in the age of intelligent machines in the 80s. The age of spiritual machines talked a lot about the downsides of what was called GNR, genetics, nanotechnology, robotics, and started kind of a firestorm of this issue that these new technologies, which seem to be bringing a lot of good things, did have risks attendant to them. Subtle risks like privacy and bias inherent in AI, and then existential risks, which we've certainly seen portrayed in dystopian futurist movies. I do take comfort from the fact that We don't see the scenario that's portrayed in many of these movies, where it's the AI versus a brave band of humans for control of the world. There isn't one or two AIs in the world. There's several billion of them at last count, and they're very closely integrated with us. When I was in college, I had to take my bicycle across campus to get to the one computer we all shared. I went to MIT because it actually had a computer, and also to study with my mentor, Marvin Minsky. Now they're in our pockets, they hang from our belts, they're going to go inside our bodies. That's already started. And so AI is really a brain extender. That's why we use technology in general, is to go beyond our limitations. We couldn't reach fruit at that higher branch 1,000 years ago, so we created tools that extended our reach. Who here could build this building? So we have tools that leverage our muscles. A teenager in Africa can now access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes with their smartphone. So they are brain and body extenders. They're going to literally make us smarter. We can talk about my scenario for how I think that will happen. And I think that tends to keep it safe. And we have a scenario or a paradigm for keeping these technologies safe. 40 years ago, some visionaries saw both the promise and the peril of biotechnology. Neither was actually feasible at that point, but they held a conference at the Asilomar Conference Center in California, which became known as the Asilomar Biotech Conference, and came up with the Asilomar guidelines for strategies to keep biotech safe and ethical standards for responsible practitioners. And there's been successive conferences. This has been updated every few years, and it's worked very well. We're now getting profound benefit. It's just a trickle today. It'll be a flood over the next decade from biotechnology. The number of people who've been harmed by either intentional or accidental abuse of biotechnology so far is approximately zero. That doesn't mean we can cross it off our concern list. Okay, we took care of that one. But it is a good paradigm for how to keep these ultimate technologies safe. We just had our first Asilomar conference last year on AI ethics. I think it is the most profound issue facing humanity. How can we reap the profound promise of these exponential technologies while managing the peril?
So you certainly believe that there should be some sort of ethical guidelines here and a degree of oversight. Is that happening in practice today? And
well, first of all, I mean, we have tremendous amount of regulation. So anytime AI or biotech or any of these technologies actually affect something, there's a tremendous amount of oversight. So let's say in medicine and biology, we've got the FDA and all kinds of regulations. Anytime any of these technologies affects anything we do, there's a tremendous amount of regulation. So it's not like we live in an unregulated society. And these things, influence us in terms of products and services. We have a myriad of regulations, and there's debate as to how extensive those should be. So it's not unregulated. It's very hard to regulate just a basic technology until it actually affects something.
right. So, yeah, I mean, we're regulating after the fact, and I think that is what probably causes a lot of the hand-wringing, is this response that might come too late. Self-improving tech, how do you see us preventing it from running away from itself? If we're not regulating companies till after the fact, what are we doing right now in programming and engineering to ensure that self-improving technology and machine learning, the interest thereof doesn't diverge from human interests?
Well, I mean, there are issues now. For example, AI is learning from humans, and apparently some humans have bias and opinions that we don't want our AIs to share. So there's a lot of effort to try to recognize the bias in AI and try to address that. We try to recognize the bias in humans and try to counteract that. So anytime AI actually impacts the world, there's a lot of observation of it. You mentioned Smart Reply, which comes from my group at Google. We've gone to efforts to try to actually understand the emails correctly and not provide biased responses, but the software does learn from humans, so we have to constantly look after it, make sure that it reflects the kind of values we want. But at the same time, it's not a clear-cut issue because we don't want to be censoring the software either and providing one set of values over another. We try to keep it neutral, but so that's one example of trying to monitor the behavior of AI. In terms of it being dangerous, I mean, again, if it's, for example, something that goes inside the body, there's a tremendous amount of regulation. There is concern of AI being used in military systems. I think really that strategy, I think that what makes the most sense is to try to practice the values that we espouse and hold dear in our social and political systems to begin with. And that may not sound like a foolproof strategy, and it's not. But AI is really an amplification already of human judgments, human policies, human ideas, and even before we had AI, human behavior has not been perfect. But I would say that we're moving towards a more peaceful world, a more democratic world, as with the increase of communications. We had the first stirrings of democracy with Gutenberg's books. And the number of democracies in the world a century ago, you could count on the fingers of one hand. The number of democracies 2 centuries ago, you could count on the fingers of one finger. The world's not a perfect democracy today, but there are dozens of well-functioning democracies. It has become a consensus that that is how we want to govern the world. And this is the most peaceful time because we've become very sensitive to any... We have a natural empathy for small groups of people. So there's some outrage 10,000 miles away, and our hearts go out to that, and it's painful, but it actually generates action and reaction. There were 50 million people killed in World War II, and people might read about it in a small newspaper article days later. A century ago, you wouldn't even hear about these battles at all. By every measure, your chance of being killed in either state-sponsored violence or interpersonal violence is dozens, if not hundreds of times less than it was centuries ago, I think because of the prevalence of communication technology.
So I want to come back to something you said a minute or two ago about human bias and the bias that inevitably infuses AI as it learns from its creators, and a situation that is improving, but still as it stands right now, largely there's a lack of diversity amongst the engineers and programs who are creating this technology. Do you feel that there are concrete steps being taken on behalf of the engineers and programmers to make sure that that their own subconscious biases and their own empathetic tendencies aren't being infused or learned by the AI?
It's a good question, and I think a more significant issue is AI is learning from humans.
Right.
It'll read millions of documents, and that's how it learns about the world. There are significant efforts at all of these companies, Google, Microsoft, Apple, to debias software, recognize biases that we don't want. So for example, software just reading about the world may come to the conclusion that surgeons are male, because that's what it reads. And that's not an association we want, because surgeons are females and can be. And so we try to correct that, but it's not it's a complicated issue because then you're starting to provide your own values, and what should those be, and the whole idea of services provided by companies like Apple and Google is not to provide the values and ideas of the company. Nonetheless, there are efforts to try to debias software. A more significant issue than unconscious bias by the engineers is really the bias that exists in the human documents that these programs are learning from. So that's an ongoing issue. It's a major effort on the part of all these companies. We've looked at smart reply. It's actually complicated because we can't actually read people's emails, because that's another issue, which is privacy. So we have to actually wait for people to potentially complain. And we're actually getting very positive responses. We're not getting complaints that the software is showing bias, and that's because of efforts we put in to try to avoid that. But it's not a straightforward issue, because it's the same thing with humans. I mean, human children learn from other humans and will adopt, consciously or otherwise, the biases in their midst. So it's a role of education, is to provide the values that we espouse as a society.
What you're saying about AI learning biases from documents is really interesting to me. Do you think there's some sort of conscious effort, or will there be some sort of effort on behalf of the engineers to, I don't know, create an algorithm or something such that the biases, let me rephrase that. Would there be a bias filtering process?
Well, that's exactly what is being worked on, to try to avoid really egregious examples of bias that we generally recognize as being out of the mainstream. But then you're trying to provide ideas and balances of views that are beyond what's reflected in human documents that the systems are learning from. And so then you have to decide what are the ideas that you want to espouse, what are ideas that you don't want the systems to learn, and that's complicated and difficult. The idea is really not to filter out. I mean, Google is really trying to provide information. When you search for something, you may find documents in your search that reflect ideas you don't agree with, but that's intentional. We don't want to be filtering out human ideas. We want really to be a neutral exploration of them. So it's an area of ongoing effort to try to avoid obvious problems, but where you draw the line is complicated.
You started this session by saying you were an optimist, and do you feel that you kind of get a bad rap for being an optimist? Well,
the world does have a pessimistic view. There was a poll taken of 24,000 people in 26 countries, and they were asked a number of questions. Poverty is a typical one, and people were very pessimistic. They were asked, has poverty gotten better or worse in the world over the last 20 years? 90% said incorrectly that it's gotten worse. Only 1% identified correctly that it's fallen by 50% over the last 20 years. So people really feel that on all these measures, literacy, poverty, health, things are getting worse when they're actually getting dramatically better every year, and exponentially so. But we don't recognize that. I had an onstage dialogue with Christine Lagarde at her annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund, and she said, well, where's the productivity enhancement that we're supposed to see from digital technology? I said, well, we don't measure it because we factor it out. We put it in the numerator and the denominator. So when this teenager in Africa spends $75 for her smartphone, it counts as $75 of economic activity, despite the fact that it's literally $1 trillion of computation and communication circa 1965, $1 billion circa 1980. It has millions of dollars of free information apps, just one of which, one of thousands, is an encyclopedia, much better than the one I spent thousands of dollars for as a teenager and saved up from my paper route. And it counts for nothing because it's free. So we don't count all of these fantastic productivity gains because a dollar of information technology is still a dollar. She said, okay, that's true of this fantastic world of digital technology. It's remarkable, but you can't wear information technology. You can't eat it. You can't live in it. And my next point was all of that's going to change as well. We're going to print out clothing at pennies per pound. Not yet. We need really submicron resolutions and faster speed and lower costs and 3D printing. But in the 2020s, there'll be lots of cool designs you can download for free, print out for pennies per pound. For clothing, people still spend money for cool proprietary designs, so the fashion industry won't go away, just as the music industry hasn't gone away with online music. You'll print out modules to snap together Lego-style houses and buildings. That's been demonstrated in Asia. We'll have vertical agriculture, hydroponic plants for fruits and vegetables, in vitro cloning of muscle tissue for meat, controlled by AI, very inexpensive. The 50% deflation rate that's inherent in information technology will then be attendant to these kinds of resources we don't associate with being information technology. And finally she said, okay, but the one resource that's you can't really produce in this exponential way is land. We're already very crowded together. And I said, it's really not true. We're only crowded together because we decided to crowd ourselves together. Cities was an early technology so we could aggregate, congregate, and work and play together. Try taking a train trip anywhere in the world and you'll see that 95% of the land is unused. And we can spread out when we have virtual communication that allows us really to work and play anywhere and still be together.
Okay, I'm going to pivot for a second because you've got some new work that illustrates principles and possibilities for a brighter future and a roadmap for your optimism, if you could talk about that for a second.
Yeah, well, about 10 years ago I had these fantasies of a young girl who was very precocious and very intelligent. It was really an exercise in the power of intelligence, and that's been my theme, but I've talked about it in an abstract sort of nonfiction way. So I was imagining, what if there was a very precocious young person, say a young girl, who was remarkably intelligent? What impact would that have on the world? And so I wrote a novel called Danielle Chronicles of Superheroine. This is a picture of her. I don't know if you can see that from here. And the story is told by her sister Claire. Claire is a survivor of the Haitian earthquake. She's adopted by an American family when she's 6. 2 years later, her sister Danielle is born. And she tells the story of Danielle from 0 to 22. And Danielle solves a lot of problems. She cures cancer when she's 12. She finds that she actually can't distribute this cure because of the Food and Drug Administration, so she does a very clever end run around that, again using her intelligence. She brings peace to the Middle East. She becomes president of the United States at 19. They pass a special one-person amendment for her. And in the preface, I state, this is really a thought experiment. What if one person was extraordinarily intelligent and also courageous and creative and compassionate? What impact would that have? And then I say, imagine if we were all Danielles, and that will happen by 2045. So this is a fictional way of really expressing my sentiments about the power of intelligence and personal courage. And if you pick up this card, if you didn't get one on the way in, you can pick it up on the way out and get a free book inscribed by the author, which is me, when the book comes out this summer. Your shipping information won't be shared with anyone. But that's a free copy of the book.
Says the guy from Google. We tease because we love.
It also includes two nonfiction companion books, which is kind of a literary first. One is How You Can Be a Danielle, which is practical advice, how you personally can use your intelligence and courage to positively impact the world, including children. And then there's another companion book called A Chronicle of Ideas, which is Danielle's and my unique spin on the concepts in the book.
And we have a trailer for that, if we could cue that up real quick.
That'd be great.
People always ask me, what's it like? What's it like to be the sister of a superheroine? I tell them it's fun. I remember when our stage was small and we'd sing our stuffed animals to sleep. I tell them it's beautiful. I remember the night we traveled across Zambia by donkey. We'd come to help with the water crisis. I tell them it's exhilarating. I remember the moment Danielle resolved the Libyan civil war. I tell them it's inspiring. I remember Danielle at the congressional podium, uniting left and right, her greatest stage yet. And I tell them sometimes it's hard. Danielle's brilliance can't always save her from sadness. It's a good thing I'm here.
Claire, I need you.
What's it like to be Danielle's sister? It's the best material a writer could ask for.
We've spoken, and you've spoken before, about the hierarchy of intelligence. Danielle clearly has augmented intelligence. How far up the hierarchy?
Okay, so this is a 200 million year story. How much time do we have?
We're fine.
So 200 million years ago, mammals evolved with a brain structure called the neocortex, which means new rind, which is an outer layer of the brain that could actually understand the hierarchical nature of the world and could invent new behaviors. So these early mammals were rodents, and they could invent a new behavior. So they're escaping a predator, its path is blocked, it'll invent a new behavior to cope with that. Probably wouldn't work, but if it did work, it would remember that. That could actually spread virally through the community. Another mouse watching this might go, that was really clever going around that rock. I'm going to remember to do that. And they would invent a new behavior. Animals without a neocortex, which is to say non-mammalian animals, couldn't do that. Didn't help very much because all the non-mammalian animals were very well evolved for their ecological niches. So the mammals stayed out of the way. And not much happened for 135 million years. 65 million years ago, something did happen. There was a sudden violent change to the world. If you dig down to an area of rock reflecting 65 million years ago, the geologists will explain that this shows a sudden violent catastrophic change to the environment. And we see it all around the globe. And we call it today the Cretaceous extinction event because that's when the dinosaurs went extinct. 75% of all the animal and plant species went extinct because it couldn't cope with this change. That's when mammals overtook their ecological niche. And to anthropomorphize, biological evolution said to itself, this neocortex is pretty good stuff, and it began to grow it. And now mammals got bigger, their brains got bigger at an even faster pace, taking up a larger fraction of their body, and the neocortex got bigger even faster than that, developing these curvatures that we associate with a primate brain. And so now primates really became ascendant. 2 million years ago, biological evolution decided to expand the neocortex even further and develop these large foreheads to house the frontal cortex. Up until recently, it was thought that frontal cortex must be qualitatively different because it does such different things. My thesis has always been it was just an additional quantity of neocortex. Now, the neocortex is organized as modules. Each module can recognize a pattern, and they're organized in hierarchies, and we create that hierarchy with our own thinking. It's a thesis I actually had 50 years ago. It's how I got to meet President Johnson. I've been thinking about this for 50 years. We're using an architecture along these lines for Smart Reply and other software, Google, that can actually understand the meaning of natural language. So we got an additional amount of neocortex 2 million years ago with these large foreheads. Remember what we did with it? Well, we were already doing a very good job of being primates, so we put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. And as you go up the hierarchy, things get more interesting. At the very bottom of the hierarchy, I can tell that that's a straight line. At the top of the hierarchy, I can tell that that's funny or that's ironic. So that additional neocortex, that additional levels of hierarchy, was the enabling factor for us to invent language and art and music. Every human culture we've ever discovered has music. No primate culture has music. There's debate about that, but I believe it's the case. So we're going to do it again. We're going to create synthetic neocortex in the cloud. We have rough models of the neocortex already. It's not perfect, but that's what we're trying to do today. I think by the 2030s, we'll have very realistic models of the neocortex, and we'll have medical nanorobots that go inside our bodies, keep us healthy by extending the immune system, providing virtual and augmented reality from within the nervous system, but most significantly, attaching the top levels of our neocortical hierarchy to synthetic neocortex in the cloud. Just the way that this connects to the cloud, and these are brain extenders. They're not directly connected in the brain, and they're not really connecting to extend our neocortex today, but that's what it'll do in the 2030s directly from our neocortex. The only difference from what we did 2 million years ago is that was a one-shot deal. If our foreheads kept expanding, birth would have become impossible. This expansion wirelessly into the cloud will not be a one-shot deal because the cloud is not limited by a fixed enclosure. It's growing exponentially as we speak. So it will become a hybrid of biological and non-biological intelligence. The non-biological part will grow exponentially. And again, just like it did 2 million years ago, we'll put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. So we'll invent new ways of relating, communicating with each other, new art forms that we can't even imagine today. Try explaining music to a primate or language to a primate that just doesn't have enough neocortical capacity to comprehend those concepts. We'll again create fantastic new ways to relate to each other. But that, as I said earlier, is what we do with technology. It extends our reach and we go beyond our limitations. We're the only species that does that.
So
Did that answer your question?
it does, but it also essentially, you're essentially projecting that after a certain point, or at a certain point, we'll be able to augment creativity. And
Right.
what does that mean for unenhanced creativity, and how do we measure one against the other?
Well, I mean, who's unenhanced today? Maybe the Amish choose not to use cell phones. I'm not sure. They do use some technology. 98% of people use some form of digital enhancement. No, who here could do their work or get an education without the brain enhancers we already have? And people say, oh, well, only the wealthy be able to afford these forms of enhancement. I say, yeah, like smartphones, of which there's 2.5 billion in the world today. There'll be 5 or 6 billion in a few years. In fact, you had to be wealthy to have a mobile phone 20 years ago, and they didn't work very well, and they only did one thing, which is make phone calls poorly. Today they do a million things, and they're in billions of hands. So that's because of this 50% deflation rate with digital technology. It's only affordable by the wealthy at a point in time where they don't actually work. By the time they work well, they're ubiquitous.
I guess let's not say enhanced then for a second. Let's talk about augmented creativity, creativity post-singularity.
Well, I mean, we're already augmented. My father was a brilliant musician. He couldn't hear his orchestral compositions. He'd have arguments with funders late at night to fund assembling an orchestra so he could hear his compositions. Then finally, when he got the money, I'd be up late with him running off scores on a mimeograph machine, which was hand-fed, and then he could finally hear his composition. But he couldn't change it, except maybe a few notes on the fly. I'd have to dismiss the musicians and start over again. Today, a kid in her dorm room can create a whole orchestra or a jazz band, with her MIDI keyboard and synthesizer software. So and software is creating walking bass lines and help calculate rhythmic progressions, and there are all kinds of writing tools. More sophisticated ones are coming. So it's already enhancing our creativity. We'll literally be able to comprehend more complex forms of communication, just as, say, music is a more sophisticated form of communication than what primates can do, when we actually can enhance our neocortex with its extension in the cloud.
Creativity, art, empathy, these are often the qualities to which humans assign meaningful interaction.
Right, and they exist at the top of the neocortical hierarchy.
What does meaningful interaction mean to an AI, to machine intelligence?
Well, AIs are not at human levels yet. They can do lots of things that we used to ascribe to human intelligence. In fact, one definition of AI is the field of computer science problems we haven't solved yet. As soon as we solve a problem, we say, oh, well, it's obvious that computers can play superhuman levels of chess, because that's just a combinatorial game, of Go. The rules are pretty simple. It was only a year ago that people said, oh, well, computers will never play master games of Go. It's also interesting to note that once a computer does something at sort of average adult human levels, it very quickly soars past it. So it's a moving frontier. Just a few weeks ago, computers for the first time can take these reading comprehension tests where you read a paragraph and then you have to answer questions about it at slightly better than average adult performance. There's been some criticisms of the test, that the test doesn't really assess what's called multi-chain reasoning, where you have to take several different things in the paragraph plus some real-world knowledge and put that all together to answer the question. So we're creating more sophisticated tests. But clearly, computers are, the range of performance is getting broader and broader. Driving a car used to be considered a very complex thing, and it's not a simple task like just playing a board game. You've got to take all kinds of things into consideration, including trade-offs of what the risks are of different types of actions. And the Waymo cars have gone 3.5 million miles with no incidents, which is better than humans would do. So the range of activities is getting broader and broader. Still, actually dealing with human language at human levels, say reading a novel and describing what it's about and writing a review of it and so on, these are still beyond what computers can do. That's the significance of my 2029 milestone. And I think once they achieve human levels, they will quickly go beyond it, like we saw in Go. It was only, I don't know, a year and a half ago that Computers were sort of fair, average Go players. Then they quickly defeated Lee Sedol, one of the best, if not the best, Go player in the world. And then AlphaZero quickly soared past that, using no human training. So we see very rapid progress once a computer can do something at human levels. But again, it's not an alien invasion of intelligent machines from Mars. We create these tools to make ourselves smarter and extend our own reach, and that will be the ultimate application of AI.
At some point when these tools do reach our level of intelligence, do you foresee there being a point at which we should be assigning some sort of rights to these machines?
Well, it's an interesting question. I wrote kind of a tongue-in-cheek movie called The Singularity is Near. It's the movie accompaniment to my book, The Singularity is Near. It goes back and forth between a documentary and a narrative story of a young AI named Ramona, and gets more and more intelligent, more and more human-like. She finally decides to hire Alan Dershowitz, who's a famous civil liberties lawyer, who plays himself, to press for her legal rights to be recognized as a human. And the judge says, okay, I'll grant you human rights if you can pass a Turing test. So she gets coaching from Tony Robbins, who plays himself, to learn the secret of what it means
fiction?
to be human.
I said, this is fiction?
That was fiction, yeah. And it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it is a serious issue. There are features of artificial intelligence that AIs can share their skills in ways that humans can't do. We can teach each other, but we can't just transfer our thoughts and skills directly, like a digital file. So we don't think of AIs having human qualities, but once they really do have the depth of human intelligence, and the essence of a Turing test is to actually be convincingly emotional and empathetic. That's really the cutting edge of human intelligence. And once it does that, in my view, these are conscious beings. But I will say that consciousness is not a scientific issue. Some scientists talk about it like it's just an obvious thing that you can measure. There's no falsifiable experiment you can run that definitively says, okay, this one's conscious, this one isn't. There's no machine you can build, slide an entity in, the green light goes on, okay, this one's conscious, this one isn't. That doesn't have some philosophical assumptions built into it. So one philosopher might require that it be squirting human biological neurotransmitters, otherwise it's not conscious. Dan Dennett, an AI philosopher at Tufts, would want it to make sure that it had a model of its own thinking, but didn't matter what the substrate is. That's maybe a little closer to my view. But these are all philosophical leaps of faith. There's really no scientific proof. So some scientists, including my mentor at times, Marvin Minsky, would say, well, you're right, it's not scientific, so therefore it's an illusion, we shouldn't waste time on it. That's not my view either, because our whole moral system is based on consciousness. A young child is precious because he or she is conscious. Non-conscious entities are only important insofar as they affect the conscious experience of conscious entities. So an important moral debate is who and what is conscious. That's behind the whole issue of animal rights. And we will debate the consciousness and therefore the moral rights and rights to liberties and so on of AIs. But it'll be tricky because of these other properties of AIs. But we will then ultimately enjoy those features as well.
Given the rate of progress, it's a philosophical issue, but it we'll be forced to confront it because of science.
Exactly.
Can you give us a date when we'll have to seriously consider?
Well, 2029.
2029, that's it?
And we'll merge with them in the early 2030s. A whole nother exponential trajectory is nanotechnology. There's a lot of progress being made, and there's already little devices actually you can put in your bloodstream that will carry out diagnostic and therapeutic procedures. I believe they'll be quite sophisticated in the early 2030s. As I mentioned, they'll extend our immune system. That's the third bridge to radical life extension. They will provide virtual and augmented reality, but most importantly, they will extend our intelligence and will emerge with these intelligent entities. But it's really a continuation of what we've been doing for thousands of years with technology, is overcoming our own limitations, and no other species really does that.
Okay, I'm going to turn it to audience questions now because we've got some very good ones. What's the next major industry to die?
Well, I think every industry
As long as we're talking optimism.
every industry is transformed, so they don't die, they just get changed in nature. So if you viewed yourself in the horseshoe industry in around 1910, you probably didn't have a bright future, but if you saw yourself in the transportation industry, you did. So we're going to have transformations, let's say, of agriculture, which is already greatly transformed. 38% of the population in the United States and Europe worked in agriculture in 1900. It's 2% today, but it's going to be further transformed, as I mentioned earlier, with vertical agriculture. Transportation is going to be greatly affected, not only by new means of autonomous vehicles, both on land and that fly, but really highly realistic virtual and augmented reality where you could be together. I'm giving a presentation actually in a few weeks to Australia where it'll be very realistic. I'll be able to walk along on stage and interact with other people on stage, and it'll really look like I'm there. It's kind of clumsy in that it's a lot of equipment required, so it's not something I can kind of carry in my suitcase, but we will actually be able to do that quite easily, and as we get to the mid to late 2020s, we'll be able to physically aggregate and do everything we do when we're actually physically together, including hugging each other, even if we're far apart. So this need to aggregate in cities and be very crowded and ignore 95% of the usable land, we will overcome.
Okay, so we've talked about cross-prohibitive arguments regarding tech, but let's say I have a $1 to $3 million by 2050. Am I going to be able to pay for immortality?
Well, I talk about three bridges to radical life extension in my health books and also science books. Health books co-authored with Terry Grossman, MD. Bridge 1 is what you can do right now. Bridge 2 is now unfolding, which is biotechnology, being able to reprogram the software of life. The enabling factor for that was the Genome Project. That was a perfect exponential. It doubled every year. The cost came down by half every year. That first genome cost $1 billion, finished in 2003. It's now down to $1,000. And our ability to understand, model, simulate, and most importantly, to reprogram this outdated software is also growing exponentially. And we're seeing now profound clinical applications. We can now fix a broken heart from a heart attack by reprogramming adult stem cells. I'm involved with a company where we're growing organs, run by Martine Rothblatt, who had spoken here at South by Southwest, kidneys, lungs, and hearts, installing them successfully in primates, which are pretty close to humans, coming to a human near you soon. This is all going to unfold in the next 4 or 5 years. 10 years from now, this will be a flood, and we'll really be able to program ourselves away from things like cancer. Immunotherapy is actually a very bright spot in cancer treatment. There's some spectacular trials where groups that are stage 4 terminal cancer have been brought to full remission. So all of this is unfolding and will be really mainstream over the next 10 years. The third bridge is medical nanorobots. With these, basically, we have already devices in our bloodstream that keep us healthy. They are blood cells. are T cells and other cells of the immune system. But they evolved tens of thousands of years ago, and it was not in the interest of the human species for us to live very long. So they didn't work against things that get us later on in life, like cancer. It says, oh, that's me, and doesn't go after it. So we can basically create non-biological T cells that are programmed to go against all pathogens, also overcome diseases of the organs, metabolic diseases. For example, the pancreas doesn't produce insulin, that's diabetes. So these devices will monitor the bloodstream for ideal levels of all these different nutrients, carbon dioxide, oxygen, toxins, puts them in, takes them out, augment the function of the organs. There's a scenario actually for every disease and aging process. So this is a 2030s scenario. So again, this will be expensive when it doesn't work. By the time it's perfected, it'll become like vaccines. Everyone will have access to it, ultimately very inexpensive. There's inherently a 50% deflation rate in information technology. That's what's keeping inflation in check, not policies by the government. It's really this increasingly pervasive influence of information technology. So ultimately, these things will be quite inexpensive.
All right, next audience question. What near-term, as in 1 to 3 years, innovation are you most excited about? And please be specific.
Well, yeah, 3 years actually brings us to the early 2020s. And I think then 3D printing will really get going, because we'll reach submicron resolutions, which is what you need for the interesting applications, like printing out clothing. So we'll increasingly be able to create the physical things we need. Vertical agriculture, I think it's more like 5 or 6 years for that to get going. Virtual realities had really a false start. I think that's actually typical. I've written about the life cycle of technologies. There's usually a lot of hype about a technology seen by visionaries, but the timing isn't there. Exponential growth doesn't mean instantaneous growth. So this audience probably doesn't remember the 1990s when if you had the website dog.com, you were a billionaire with the internet boom. And around the year 2000, the financial community said, now wait a second, you can't really make money with these internet companies. And we had the internet crash that almost brought down the world economy. But then it gradually came back as we actually got the price performance that we needed. So now you have little internet companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft that are worth, I think, around $2 trillion together. The same thing will happen with things like virtual and augmented reality. It was a premature start last year. There's some really interesting devices, some of which are here, that look very promising. They need to be much more streamlined. You can't carry a big bulky device around. Ultimately, they'll be kind of in our eyeglasses and ultimately contact lenses, and we'll be used to being in augmented reality all the time. So you could be sitting around a table and a friend could be there, and it really will feel and seem like they're there, even though they're not. So virtual and augmented reality, I think, will take off in about 3 or 4 years.
All right, maybe a bit of an existential question for you, but in general, what are futurists going to do after the singularity?
There'll still be a future.
Like you're going to take a day off? Or?
We can actually start futurism for real, because we have to worry about all this legacy technology we have in the physical world. But the term singularity really is a metaphor on the event horizon that we see in a physics singularity. So we borrowed this metaphor from physics, and it's really not the infinite point in the center. Actually, physics does not allow an infinite point of mass and energy. It just gets beyond our ability to measure. And there's an event horizon around that so-called singularity that's very hard to see beyond, because the information is kept in by gravity. That's a physics singularity. So in this historical singularity that we envision, it's again very hard to see beyond that horizon, because by 2045 I estimate we'll be enhancing our technology, our intelligence a billion-fold. That's such a profound transformation that we borrow this event horizon metaphor. But even in the physics singularity, we can use our intelligence to describe what it would be like to fall into a black hole, and we could describe what we'd see and what we'd feel if we could actually survive it. Similarly, in the historical singularity, we can describe what things would be like. We can use metaphors such as we'll create forms of music that we can't imagine today that'll be like what music is to humans compared to primates. And so we can talk about it in that way. But there'll still be a future. It'll just be changing much more rapidly, and it'll be much more profound, and I think we'll have a much greater need for futurists.
Okay, 2 more questions I want to get to here. First, the very important one, which is, what do you think of the theory that we may live in the Matrix?
Well, we have to define what a simulation means. So it's generally viewed that a simulation means that somebody created a computer program with a simulated world, like a computer game, and there are creatures that live inside that. And so so we can imagine if a game like that became ultra sophisticated and somebody actually created a simulation of the whole universe that we seem to live in, that would be living in a simulation. So basically that some teenager for her science fair experiments has created the world that we live in. Then the concern is, how do you convince that teenager to keep the simulation going? And I think the answer is do interesting things. So be creative, create very entrancing music. The singularity is actually quite interesting. So if we can actually have a successful singularity, we'd keep the interest of that game maker in this other universe. But another view is it's not necessarily created by a conscious entity in another universe, but that the universe itself is a computer. There's certainly a lot of evidence for that. We live in a universe that encodes information. And it's actually quite a coincidence, because there are about 50 different constants in the standard model of physics, and they have to be within very precise levels for us to live in a universe that can actually encode information. But by the anthropic principle, we do live in such a universe. We wouldn't be talking about it if we didn't. So we live in a universe that is able to create subatomic particles that can relate to each other and encode information, and then create atomic structures that encoded information. And then there's been a series of indirections. Atoms aggregated into molecules. Molecules can encode information. There evolved a particular molecule, DNA, that could actually very systematically encode information and actually then create creatures that were described by that code. Those creatures then developed brains, and those brains then learned information. Those brains combined with an opposable appendage so that we could actually create technology, then created computers that could encode information. We then gave those computers intelligence based on trying to understand our own intelligence, and then enhanced our own intelligence by merging with those devices. All of that, all of those grand evolutionary steps resulted from the fact that we do live in a universe that encodes information. And a universe that encodes information is a computer. So you could say we do live in a simulation. But whether or not there's some grand creatures watching our simulation and doing that instead of watching weekly TV programs is a philosophical question at this point.
So I'm afraid we have to wrap it up, but I think the reveal that we are living in the Matrix is probably a good note to end on. So, Ray, thank you so much for taking time to
pleasure.
be with us today.
Well, it's great to be with you. This is definitely unique. I don't think I've spoken outside before. It's a very cool setting. It's actually becoming cool too, I think. There's the Freedom Tower. It's kind of a poignant place to contemplate the future. And I particularly enjoy talking to entrepreneurs, principally being one myself. Actually decided I would become an inventor, which means being an entrepreneur, when I was 5. And I remember my parents giving me these enrichment toys, erector sets, and lots of things that had lots of parts in it. And then I would go around the neighborhood and gather things and take them apart. And I had this huge collection of little things. And I had this idea that if I could figure out the right way to put them together, I could create transcendent effects. I didn't have that vocabulary when I was 5. I came up with that a few years ago. But I can remember the feeling, just thinking, wow, I just have to figure out how to put these things together, and we could solve any problem. And I remember other kids wondering what they were going to be, a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer. I always had this conceit, I know what I'm going to do. And inventors and entrepreneurs are an optimistic group. You have to be optimistic. If you were aware of all the challenges that you're likely to encounter, you probably would never start any project. Optimism is really a self-fulfilling prophecy. I talk to lots of different types of groups, lots of professional groups. Professional groups are much readier to dismiss certain possibilities as possible. It kind of comes with a professional discipline to learn the parameters and limitations of your fields and the kinds of things that you should not do. I actually have a technique that I use to overcome professional thinking, because even as an inventor, I've been infected by some of that. Freud said that the sensors in your mind, C-E-N-S-O-R-S, are relaxed when you're dreaming. That's why you'll dream about things that are culturally or socially taboo. So I'll assign myself a problem when I go to sleep, and then I'll dream about that problem. And these various professional taboos, that you can't solve a signal processing problem using these rules, linguistics can't use those formulas, those are not followed when I'm dreaming. But then there's another step in the process, because another thing that doesn't work when you're dreaming is your rational faculties. That's why when the elephant comes to the wall, the most remarkable thing about it is that you don't think it's remarkable. And so the next step is in the morning, when I'm sort of halfway between dreaming and being awake. I have some conscious awareness that I'm actually in a bed, but I'm still in the dream. So now I still have access to these dream ideas, not all of which make sense, but which have sort of broken the shackles of my otherwise professional thinking. And I have my rational faculties, both. And invariably, I come up with new insights. In fact, that is actually how I've come up with all the insights and inventions. I mean, I will come up with an idea and then spend the rest of the day writing a patent application. Or if I run into a problem, I will work on it this way. So that's one little tip. You might try this technique. I've been kind of refining it. It doesn't work if you have an alarm clock wake you up. You kind of wrecks the mood. But thinking differently, as the Apple lads used to say, is key to being an entrepreneur, being willing to try to accomplish things that people say are impossible. Because it's important to pick the right problems. Some things really are impossible. And that's how I got into this whole issue of futurism and trying to predict the future. Because I began to think about 30 years ago, what is it that separates inventors and entrepreneurs who succeed from those that don't? And so I studied this, and it turns out it's not the ability to get your projects to work. I mean, I do now some early stage investing and mentoring of young companies, and we get lots of business plans, and I would say 95% of these teams would do exactly what they say they will do if given the resources, but most of those projects would still fail because the timing is wrong. So the timing is very important, and your project has to make sense not for the world that exists today, but the world that will exist when your project's completed. And even with the fast pace of today, it can take 2-3 years to get a project off the ground. The world will be a completely different place. It has to make sense for that world. Think about how different the world is today from just a few years ago. People didn't use social networks, wikis, blogs. I mean, Wikipedia threatened to go on strike one day. It actually went on strike. I felt like part of my brain had gone on strike. And because there was a workaround, which I'm sure many of you discovered, but it was still shocking that these brain extenders, and it really has become part of who I am, would actually go on strike. And it also shows tremendous political power that these resources have. But timing is very critical to being successful. And I realized this even back in 1981. So I tried to contemplate what is it about the future that we can anticipate reliably. And I really didn't expect to find anything that would be very reliable, because the common wisdom is you cannot predict the future. And that actually turns out to be true for specific projects. You could see that about 15 years ago, search engines were becoming feasible. People clearly needed them. There was an exponential explosion of information on the internet. We needed some way to search through it. The computational resources, communication, memory, all of those resources were coming in place to provide search engines. You couldn't have predicted that it'd be these couple of kids at Stanford with a late night dorm room challenge who would end up conquering the world of search. What you could anticipate, though, is that the resources were coming into place, that search engines would become a big deal. And you can, in fact, do that for each of the major innovations that take off. And it turns out that the basic fundamental measures of information technology are very predictable. And it really belies the common wisdom that you can't predict the future. And I'll show you a few dozen examples of that. We have hundreds of these examples. I have a team now of 10 people that gathers data in different areas of technology. And if it has to do with an information technology, the fundamental measures of it, price, performance, capacity, bandwidth, and so on, follow these very predictable trajectories. And what is predictable is that they grow exponentially. So that may not sound very interesting in and of itself until you contemplate what exponential growth means. And we're talking about price performance, which means you get, so if it's growing exponentially and the doubling time in the case of computation is now 11 months, you actually get twice as much stuff in terms of that resource, computation, for the same price every 11 months now. And that smooth trajectory goes back to the 1890 American census. Nothing had any effect on it. I'll show you that graph. You don't see any evidence or influence of World War I or World War II or the Cold War or the Great Depression. People said, well, it must have slowed down during the recent recession. Not at all. You don't see any impact. It goes through boom times and recessions, through war and peace. It's really quite remarkable how predictable it is. And exponential growth is not intuitive. And I'd say the primary difference between my critics and myself is that they're using their linear intuition, because that is hardwired in our brains, and they very often don't even bother to articulate their concern. They say, well, look at the current situation. Like, for example, halfway through the Genome Project, I had been an advocate of it. I felt human genome would be sequenced in 15 years. That was very much a renegade position because the mainstream view was there's no way it could be done in 15 years. In 1989, only 1/10,000th of the genome had been sequenced. Halfway through the project, 1% of the genome had been collected. So the critics, who were the mainstream scientists, said, see, I told you this wasn't going to work. Here you are halfway through the project and you finished 1% of the project. So 1%, 7 years, it's going to take 700 years, just like we said. And it's so obvious that you don't even have to state the logic. My view was, no, we've achieved 1%, we're almost done. And if it's an exponential trajectory, which it had been, and I felt would continue, 1% is 7 doublings from 100%. And that's in fact exactly what happened. And I'll show you the graph, and it wasn't approximate. It doubled every year. It was finished 7 years later. And every other aspect of biology has continued to scale up in this exponential manner. As was mentioned, I'm coming out with a book on the brain, and one of the elements that's true of the way we think is that we have these built-in linear predictors in our brain. In fact, that's why we have brains. It's to predict the future. That's what a brain is for. So when I walked through the savannah thousands of years ago, and I saw I'm headed in this direction, I said, oh, there's an animal going this way. I would make a linear prediction where that animal would be and said, okay, we're going to cross paths up around that tree. I'm going to take this other route. Turned out that that was pretty good for survival. That became hardwired in our brains. We have these linear predictors of the future, and it's very often it's just unsaid. It's just so obvious that things progress in a linear manner. That's actually a very good algorithm if you're predicting the path of an animal in the wild. It's not a good method for anticipating where information technology will be. And the reason for that, I mean, I have a whole theoretical analysis in my book and a mathematical treatment, none of which would be very interesting if it weren't for the very strong empirical case. Example after example, if you're talking about some measure of information technology, it grows in an exponential manner. And the reason is we're always using the latest technology to create the next. So right now we are creating the computers of 2013 and 2014 with the computers of 2012. We couldn't do that in 2002 because we didn't have the computers of 2012 at that time and the other tools to do that with. And we don't seek to improve things linearly. If we're at, you know, 1 trillion calculations per second per $1,000, we don't try to make it 1 trillion and 10. You know, we try to make it 2 trillion. So that we inherently try to advance things in multiples. But it's actually, it is remarkable to me how smooth these curves are. And I'll show you a few examples in a moment. Because you would think it would be very erratic. Like number of bits we move around wirelessly, which is a measure of the sort of telecommunications industry. And if you follow the news, there are weekly headlines of multi-billion-dollar company going bankrupt, you know, $100 billion spectrum auction, one country accused of dumping products in another. You would think that based on the vagaries of human history, it would be a very erratic curve, and maybe if you squinted at it, you'd see some general trend. It's amazing how smooth these trajectories are. And then just to appreciate the difference between linear and exponential growth, if I take 30 steps linearly, that's our intuition about the future. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I get to 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, that describes the reality of information technology. 2, 4, 8, 16, I get to 1 billion. And this is not an idle speculation about the future. I mean, this is, in terms of a computer, several billion times more powerful per dollar than the computer I used when I was a student. It's 1 million times cheaper, it's several thousand times more powerful, it's 100,000 times smaller. And that's also another smooth exponential trend. We're shrinking both electronic and mechanical technology at a rate of 100 in 3D volume per decade. And that will happen again in the next 25 years. This will again be several billion times more powerful per dollar, constant dollar. It'll be 100,000 times smaller. It'll be the size of a blood cell. It will more easily integrate with our bodies. I mean, this is pretty close to me. I'd like it to be inside my body. I wouldn't lose it that way. As I mentioned, I really do consider it part of who I am. We are becoming more intimate with our technology. So people say, okay, so that's true of this strange world of these gadgets we carry around, because we don't always carry them around. That's where we are currently in terms of this progression. But that's not going to affect the world of physical things or our health. That's the other important point I want to emphasize, that the purview of information technology is expanding to ultimately include everything we care about. I mean, take health and medicine. That was not an information technology up until recently. It was basically hit or miss. We'd find things that happened to work. Oh, here's something that lowers blood pressure. Here's something that kills HIV. To some extent, we would systematically look for things. Drug development, what's called drug discovery, and pharmaceutical companies would sort of systematically go through 20,000 compounds and just try one after the other until they found something that works. They didn't really know why it worked. Invariably, it only worked to some extent and had many side effects because it was not a design tool. Kind of harkens back to an era where our tools were things we just found on the ground. Oh, this rock could make a good hammer. We didn't have the means of actually shaping our tools for a particular purpose. That's completely changed now that we've actually, first of all, uncovered the software of life. The genome is basically little software programs that not only influence but actually is the reality of biology. Biology is a software process, and we have software running inside us. I mean, how often do you go without updating the software on your cell phone? It does it automatically. This is probably updating itself now as I speak, but I am walking around with outdated software that evolved thousands of years ago when conditions were very different. I would like to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't need to hold on to every calorie anymore. I mean, that was a good idea 1,000 years ago. You worked all day to get a few calories. There were no refrigerators, so you stored them in the fat cells of your body. That was a good idea. That now underlies an epidemic of obesity. The Joslin Diabetes Center near where I work in Boston, and I know the researchers, turned that gene off. We have means now of turning genes off with RNA interference, for example. And these animals ate ravenously and remained slim, and they didn't get diabetes, they didn't get heart disease, they lived 20% longer, they got the health benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite, and they're working with a drug company to bring that to the human market. That's just one of the 23,000 genes we'd like to tinker with. There are genes we've identified that are necessary for atherosclerosis, which produces all heart attacks and most strokes to progress, that are necessary for cancer to progress. We'd like to turn those off. There are other genes we'd like to activate or add that will protect us from these diseases. I'm working with a company where we take cells out of the body of patients with a disease called pulmonary hypertension. This is a fatal disease. Patients have a life expectancy after diagnosis of 6 to 12 months. It's caused by the lack of a gene. So if you're missing this particular gene, you have a very high likelihood of getting that disease. So we take out lung cells, we add that gene in a petri dish, spec'd it with a high-powered microscope, see that it got done correctly, replicate it several million-fold. Now we have several million cells with your DNA, but with this gene that you were missing added, inject it back in the body, goes through the bloodstream, the body recognizes them as lung cells, and this has actually cured this disease in human subjects, and it's continuing to undergo human trials. These are just two examples of either turning a gene off or adding a gene. There are hundreds of developments like this. There's a whole area of stem cells therapies where we, the scientific community, is growing artificial organs, new kidneys, livers, lungs. In fact, this company that's doing this gene therapy treatment is also growing new lungs from stem cells. The controversy about stem cells having to do with embryos has been worked around, that you can now create the equivalent of an embryonic stem cell by taking your skin cells, of which you have a lot, adding 4 genes, and it turns it into the equivalent of an embryonic stem cell that's pluripotent, that is, can become any other type of cell. These are called IPCs, induced pluripotent cells. And the ethicists who are opposed to embryonic stem cell research support this idea because it doesn't involve the destruction of embryos. And in any event, if you want a new kidney, you'd like it to have your DNA, not the DNA of some other embryo. And this is already reaching clinical practice. If you have any friends who've had a heart attack, there's a 50% chance that their heart was damaged. 50% of heart attack survivors have a damaged heart. It's called a low ejection fraction. My father had that. He could hardly walk. And then he finally died 40 years ago of that condition. Today you can fix that with stem cell therapies. The heart cannot rejuvenate itself, but now with these stem cell therapies, you basically can rejuvenate the heart while it's beating. So I don't want to, I mean, I could talk for hours, and there are, of course, whole conferences on this. The idea, though, is that health and medicine has become an information technology because we're reprogramming the software of life. And as such, it's now subject to what I call the law of accelerating returns. It's exponential growth. So these technologies will be twice as powerful next year. They'll be 1,000 times more powerful in 10 years. They'll be 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years. And it's going to have a dramatic impact on health, on longevity. How about the world of physical things? That's being transformed as well. There's a whole revolution that's just about ready to take off involving 3-dimensional printing, where you can take an information file and turn it into a physical 3-dimensional object. So if I want to send you a book or a movie or a music album, it wasn't so long ago I would send you a FedEx package. Today I can send you an email attachment, and you can then turn it into those products. But I could also send you an email attachment that you can turn into a violin if you have the right 3-dimensional printer, and I'll show you the picture of that violin, which was on the cover of The Economist not too long ago. One guy printed out an airplane, a module at a time, and snapped it together. That's how you can print out large things from these 3-dimensional printers that print out things that are more compact. At Singularity University, which is a university I founded in Silicon Valley, it's backed by NASA and Google. The students do team projects taking on world challenges, and one of the projects is in fact to build very high quality but inexpensive housing for the third world using 3-dimensional printers, basically printing out modules and snapping them together Lego style to create an inexpensive but high quality structure. The resolution is improving exponentially. Right now it's in microns, millionths of a meter, but it's improving, as I said, at a rate of 100 in 3D volume per decade. So this will be true nanotechnology. We'll be able to build things at the molecular level within 20 years. We'll be able to print out clothing, food, basically all the physical things we need. And the costs have been coming down. They've been in tens of thousands, now they're thousands. They'll be in the hundreds of dollars soon. So it's kind of right, the quiet before the storm with regard to 3-dimensional printing. But that's a transformation that you can anticipate today. And that's really a lesson that I try to share with inventors and entrepreneurs in general, to anticipate where the future will be. So let me just quickly show you some examples. And this is what I wanted to cover. Any questions on any of this? So I've covered a lot of this stuff. I'll just show you
a few salient examples. All right, so here, this graph on the right is Cooper's law. Cooper was an inventor and an entrepreneur. He invented something you may have used called the mobile phone. And I use the mobile phone as a good example to the challenge that only the rich are going to have these advances, right? And I say, yeah, like mobile phones, where only the rich had them 20 years ago. If someone took out a mobile phone in a movie, that was your signal that this person was a member of the power elite. And then he or she didn't take it out of their pocket. And it didn't work very well and did one thing poorly. Today, there are actually close to 6 billion cell phones, almost 1 billion smartphones. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to more information than the President of the United States did 15 years ago. They really are in everybody's hands. 30% of Africans have them, half the farmers in China have them, and they're becoming increasingly sophisticated. So if we look at the number of bits we move around wirelessly in the world, that's this graph on the right. It's a logarithmic scale, meaning as you go up the y-axis, we're not adding to something, we're multiplying by powers of 10, actually by 1,000. Each level that's labeled is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. So that represents over a century, actually 110 years, several trillion-fold increase in what? In the number of bits we're moving around wirelessly. But look at how smooth a transition that is. We went from Morse code over AM radio in 1900 to 4G networks today, and it's a very predictable, dramatic trajectory. So this is the first graph I had in 1981. I had it through 1980, so only through here, but I was quite amazed at how smooth a trajectory this is. This is the power of computation, calculations per second per constant dollar. This is shown in 2010 dollars. And it's a remarkably smooth transition, and again it represents trillions-fold increase, a billion-fold, just several billion-fold just since I was a student. Every level here is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. People say, oh, that's Moore's law. Moore's law is just the part on the right having to do with chips. This trend started decades before Gordon Moore was even born. And for example, they were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s. CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower in 1952. First time the networks did that with a vacuum tube-based computer. And then they were making vacuum tubes smaller and smaller to keep that trend going. That finally hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. But it was not the end of this broader phenomena of the law of accelerating returns. It just went to the fourth paradigm, transistors, and then to chips. And people are talking about the end of Moore's law. Gordon Moore originally, who's quite conservative on these things, and I don't think really gets the implications of Moore's law. He said it would end in 2002. Intel now says 2022. By that time, the key features will be 5 nanometers, which is the width of about 20 carbon atoms. And we won't be able to shrink them anymore, but we'll go to the sixth paradigm, which is computing in 3 dimensions, which has already started. But I mean, look at how smooth a trajectory that is. And it's just a nice smooth curve, but at every point, it introduces new market opportunities, new entrepreneurial ventures that become possible. You can get one transistor for $1 in 1968. You can get billions of them today. They're better because they're smaller, so they're faster. And the cost of a transistor cycle has come down by half every year. That's a 50% deflation rate, economically speaking. It means you can get, so whatever the cost was of a million doing a million calculations last year, or sending 1 million bits on the internet, or sending 1 million bits wirelessly, or sequencing 1 million base pairs of DNA, or downloading 1 million bytes of scanning data from the brain, it'll cost half as much today. And when we get to 3-dimensional printing, we're actually literally talking about physical stuff. And so the economists actually worry about this, saying, well, gee, if you can get the same stuff for half the price a year later, okay, you will buy more. That's an economic reality. But you're not going to double your consumption because you only need so much. So you'll increase somewhat, but you won't quite double. And so the size of the economy, as measured in currency, will go down, not as measured in bits and bytes and base pairs. And for a variety of good reasons, that would actually be a bad thing. And that's actually not what we see. We actually more than double every year. This is bits of memory ship, but I have 50 other graphs like this showing the consumption of these information technologies. It's grown 18% per year, every year for the last 50 years in constant dollars, despite the fact you can get twice as much of it per dollar each year. And the reason for that is that price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications just suddenly explode. And that's the entrepreneurial opportunity. So social networks didn't happen in the year 2000 because the price performance wasn't there to support it. But 2004, it started to be interesting. It really exploded a few years after that. You can anticipate where these opportunities become feasible. So biotechnology, very smooth progression, and the cost of DNA, the first genome cost $1 billion. We're now down to about $10,000. And every aspect of biology is scaling up at an exponential rate. Communication technology, which is very democratizing. In my first book, which I wrote in the 1980s, The Age of Intelligent Machines, I wrote that the Soviet Union would be swept away by the then emerging social network, which was early forms of email over teletype machines and fax machines, and there was this clandestine network of hackers who kept everybody in the know. And I said, this is quite subversive, and this is going to sweep the Soviet Union away. And people thought that was overstated. The Soviet Union was a mighty superpower. It was not going to be swept away by a few teletype machines. But that's actually exactly what happened in that coup against Gorbachev in 1991. And the photo op, the cover of Time magazine, showed Yeltsin bravely standing on the tank. The tank had nothing to do with it. It was the network of hackers who were keeping everybody in the know using this very democratizing, decentralized electronic communication. And we then had a great wave of democracies with the rise of the web in the 1990s. We see the impact today of social networks. History never goes in very clean steps, but it's very democratizing. Even in countries where there are regrettable limitations, in China or Iran, there's actually tremendous amount of free communication that represents a democratizing force that ultimately, I believe, will prevail. And if you look at the world today, democracy is a norm. It was not the case in the middle of the 20th century at all. There were a handful of democracies. It was not considered necessarily the best system. Actually, Winston Churchill said it was the worst system, except for all the others. But, and it's also democratizing other relationships. A woman goes into a visit with her doctor, and she has a chronic disease. She's part of a community of people who have that disease. She'll be more informed about it than the doctor. Those communities are actually taking the cures into their own hands and doing collaborative decision making. So it's a very powerful phenomenon. And most of all, it's democratizing in terms of the tools of creativity. So a kid with a laptop computer created Facebook, and a couple of kids, as I mentioned, with this dorm room challenge, which is what it was, created Google, and there's many other examples. To really actually create a technology and demonstrate it does not take a lot of financial resources because these tools are so powerful. This is a graph. I had this graph through about here in the early 80s. This is the number of nodes on the internet
It was called the ARPANET at that time, so it was a few thousand people. It was like 2,000 scientists. But I did the math and said, wow, this is going to be a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people to each other and to vast knowledge resources by the late 1990s, and people thought that was nuts, given that the entire U.S. defense budget could only tie together 2,000 scientists that year. But that is the power of exponential growth. That is what happened. This information on the right here, this display, is the same data, but seen on a linear scale. And that's actually how we experience the world. So to the casual observer, it looked like the World Wide Web came out of nowhere. But you could see it coming if you looked at the exponential progressions. So here's that violin. It's an actual violin that was printed out on a three-dimensional printer. This is going to be a very revolutionary technology. This precision and the price performance are both scaling up exponentially. We will ultimately apply this to medicine. There's been a lot of work done, particularly by the faculty at Singularity University, on applying this to medicine. This is a design of a robotic red blood cell that stores and releases oxygen, carbon dioxide, just like a biological red blood cell, except that it's 1,000 times more powerful. And if you would replace a portion of your red blood cells with these little robots called respirocytes, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. So, honey, I'm in the pool. It'll take on a whole new significance. ESPN interviewed me and said, we're going to ban these, right? And I said, I don't think so, and I don't think we should. We should ban steroids because steroids are bad for your long-term health. And if you don't ban them, then you're forcing athletes to do something that's bad for their long-term health in order to get a short-term performance boost. That's a problem anyway, to the extent that the rules aren't really enforced very well. But these will be good for your health. They'll actually protect your heart from a heart attack. They'll lead to better oxygenation of your tissues. And if you ban them, you'll have high school kids outperforming the Olympic athletes. So we'll have to adjust our rules, but this, I think, will be ultimately a mainstream health technology a couple of decades from now. Really the quintessential application of nanotechnology to health is a robotic white blood cell that would augment your immune system. Our immune system is great. We wouldn't last long without it. But it's full of limitations. It doesn't recognize cancer, for example. It says, hey, that's me. And so it doesn't think it's an enemy. Sometimes it thinks that you are the enemy. Those are autoimmune disorders. It's not very effective against many viruses. So we could create a non-biological immune system that would overcome these limitations, could download new software for new pathogens as they emerge, and so on. I used to call it the killer app, but that wasn't a good designation for a health technology. So Time Magazine did a cover story on my law of accelerating returns and the singularity, which is sort of the point where these technologies become truly transformative. And they wanted to print this computer graph, and they said, well, we want you to put this particular computer on the graph that we had covered a few weeks ago. I said, okay. I knew it would not be above the curve, because that never happens, but it could be below the curve. If you have, these are the best computers at any point in time in terms of price performance. But it's actually right on the curve. It's the last point there. And this is a curve that I laid out 30 years ago. And I'm not just overfitting to past data. This was a projection from 30 years ago. And I carried it out to 2050, and that shows some very profound transformations. And it's not just hardware, it's also software, which brings me to the last topic I'll talk about, which is related to this book that I just wrote that's coming out. And we're making exponential gains in understanding the brain, the spatial resolution of brain scanning, the amount of data we're scanning about the brain, the scale and precision of simulations of brain regions. All of these are scaling up exponentially. And I talk about in the book a key method that's used in the neocortex. That's this little region of the brain where we do our thinking. So it's an important region. The neocortex is capable of thinking in hierarchies. So we can think in a hierarchical fashion. And the world is basically organized hierarchically. And biological evolution stumbled on this design of a neocortex. It's a flat structure. It's like paper thin. And on these very small mammals that first emerged 100 million years ago, it was just a very thin sheet kind of covering the brain. But it enabled these animals to be very clever because they could then think in a hierarchical fashion. And so over time, that region became bigger and bigger. And it, first of all, became convoluted and has all these elaborate folds, which gives it more surface area. If you were to take the neocortex is still a flat structure in the human brain, covers the brain, except it has all these convoluted and variegated modulations in its shape. If you were to stretch it out, it would be about the size of a table napkin and about the same thickness. And it comprises 80% of the brain. And it's where we do our thinking. And the big innovation with humans is we have more of it. We have this big forehead where we could put in the frontal cortex to allow a larger amount of neocortex. And with that quantitative change came a qualitative change, because now, having kind of taken care of certain basic needs, we had now enough neocortex to create language, and then literature, and art, and science, and all of that came from having this greater level of neocortex. And in 3 minutes, what the neocortex does is it recognizes patterns. And so I have little pattern recognizers. I've actually counted them, or estimated the number. There's about 300 million in the neocortex, and they're all the same. That's a key element. So I've got little pattern recognizers that recognize the crossbar in a capital A, and the fact that an S has a concave region facing east and west, and so on. So I have little pattern recognizers that recognize these very basic geometric shapes. And then at a higher level, it will actually recognize, oh, there's an S, and there's an I, and there's an M. And then at a higher level, it recognizes, oh, there's the word simulation. And if you go up another 30 levels of conceptual abstraction in this hierarchy, there are pattern recognizers that go, oh, that was ironic. Oh, that's funny. She's pretty. You probably think that those very high-level recognizers are much more complicated than the ones that are just recognizing sort of basic geometric shapes. They're actually the same. They just exist in different levels of this hierarchy. And the hierarchy is, you're not born with that hierarchy. That's why you can't talk about quantum physics with a newborn. She has not developed all the conceptual levels to get there. We wire the neocortex ourselves based on what we learn, and we are able to create one conceptual level at a time. So it takes time to get up to those conceptual levels. So our brain, that is, our neocortex, creates our thoughts, but our thoughts create our brain, quite literally. Those connections are created by what we're thinking. And so be careful who you hang out with, because it will very literally affect your brain. And we can see that on brain scans. And I describe in the book how this module works, how it recognizes a pattern, and how these different pattern recognizers create their own hierarchies, and how the whole hierarchical system works, and then apply it to different types of thinking. But you might wonder, 300 million, is that a good number or bad? Is that a lot? Well, from one perspective, it's a lot. It was enough for human beings to create science and art and literature and technology. On the other hand, it's also quite limited. And personally, I run into these limitations all the time. We can't remember things.
We can become a master in one field, and we can't just very quickly become a master in another field. Einstein was a brilliant physicist. He was a mediocre violinist. Jascha Heifetz had an interest in physics, but he was no Einstein. How about if we had 400 million? Or how about a billion? Or how about a trillion? That is where we're headed, particularly as we learn how these modules work. And I have a thesis in the book, and it's actually a method, it turns out, that has become popular in artificial intelligence. It's a technique that I pioneered in the 1980s and 1990s called hierarchical hidden Markov models. It's a technical concept actually based on a mathematical theory by a 19th century Russian mathematician. That technique is used almost universally in speech recognition. It's very common in natural language understanding, even speech synthesis. So Siri, when it understands you, or when it speaks, or when it's understanding natural language, are using the same techniques. It turns out that the neocortex works and it uses, and it's not because we were copying the neocortex. It just evolved in the field of AI because it happened to work. It evolved in the neocortex because it happened to work. And it's interesting that these techniques are mathematically equivalent. But ultimately, we will create more neocortex, and ultimately we'll connect to it very intimately in the brain by sending nanobots into the brain, which will interact wirelessly with our biological neurons and extend it. And that additional neocortex will be out in the cloud, just as we use the cloud today. When you use your iPhone and use Siri or translate languages, it doesn't take place on the phone, it takes place in the cloud. So our thinking will ultimately migrate to the cloud as well. If putting computers inside your brain and communicating between biological neurons and computers sounds very futuristic, I point out there's a lot of people doing it already, like Parkinson's patients. The latest generation of that FDA-approved neural implant allows you to download new software to the neural implant from outside the patient. So that requires surgery today. It's small, it's pea-sized. It's not yet blood cell size, but that's where we're headed. 25, 30 years from now, these will be feasible scenarios. So let me just quickly show you one thing which I think is worthwhile, which is to put all this together. And I mean, this is all driven by innovation and entrepreneurs like yourself. But is it making the world a better place? Certainly making it a cooler place, but I go around the world and there's a remarkable amount of pessimism that the world is getting worse, and the world is much worse than it was before it was spoiled by technology. And I think in my view, what's happening is we have much better information today about what's wrong with the world. When there's a battle in Fallujah or a medical crisis in Nigeria, we experience it because we're there. We never had that immediacy before. People forget what things are like, but okay, here's the world in 1800. Those are countries. On the x-axis, income per person was in the hundreds of dollars. There is a have-not divide, but nobody had very much money. Life expectancy was in the 20s and 30s. It was 37 worldwide. So what happened? Well, a few countries were experimenting with industrialization and automation in the early 19th century and started to make some progress. When we get to the 1900s, this catches on worldwide, and you'll see a wind that carries all of these nations towards the upper right-hand corner of the graph. The have-not divide remains, but at the end of the process, the countries that are worst off are much better off than the countries that are best off at the beginning of the process. And the process, I shouldn't say end of the process, because the process has hardly ended. In fact, it's going to go into high gear now that, for example, three-dimensional printing will bring the world of physical things at extremely low cost. Today, with your three-dimensional printer, you can print out 70% of the parts you need to create another three-dimensional printer. That'll be 100% in 5 to 10 years. So ultimately, this will be a very inexpensive technology. So I'll just show you
one last graph, which is the progress we made before health and medicine was an information technology. I gave a speech to middle school kids recently, and I told them at the end that you all would be senior citizens if it hadn't been for the progress we've made. And this group here would definitely be over the hill. But this is going to go into high gear now that health and medicine is an information technology. And according to my models, 15 years from now, we'll be adding more than a year every year to your remaining life expectancy. That's a tipping point. It's not a guarantee, but it means as we go forward in time, your life expectancy will move on away from you. So if you can hang in there, we may get to see the remarkable century ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So now Ray will spend a few minutes taking questions from the audience. We have some mics that are floating around, but we'll start here, and you can just shout out your question so we can keep moving. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So I run 4 companies, 2 of which are technology-based.
Why only 4? So what is it that separates inventors and entrepreneurs who succeed from those that don't? And so I studied this, and it turns out it's not the ability to get your projects to work. I mean, I do now some early stage investing and mentoring of young companies, and we get lots of business plans, and I would say 95% of these teams would do exactly what they say they will do if given the resources, but most of those projects would still fail because the timing is wrong. So the timing is very important, and your project has to make sense not for the world that exists today, but the world that will exist when your project's completed. And even with the fast pace of today, it can take 2-3 years to get a project off the ground. The world will be a completely different place. It has to make sense for that world. Think about how different the world is today from just a few years ago. People didn't use social networks, wikis, blogs. I mean, Wikipedia threatened to go on strike one day. It actually went on strike. I felt like part of my brain had gone on strike. And because there was a workaround, which I'm sure a few years ago, but I can remember the feeling, just thinking, wow, I just have to figure out how to put these things together, and we could solve any problem. And I remember other kids wondering what they were going to be, a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer. I always had this conceit, I know what I'm going to do. And inventors and entrepreneurs are an optimistic group. You have to be optimistic. If you were aware of all the challenges that you're likely to encounter, you probably would never start any project. Optimism is really a self-fulfilling prophecy. I talk to lots of different types of groups, lots of professional groups. Professional groups are much readier to dismiss certain possibilities as possible. It kind of comes with a professional discipline to learn the parameters and limitations of your fields and the kinds of things that you should not do. Well, it's great to be with you. This is definitely unique. I don't think I've spoken outside before. It's a very cool setting. It's actually becoming cool too, I think. There's the Freedom Tower. It's kind of a poignant place to contemplate the future. And I particularly enjoyed talking to entrepreneurs, principally being one myself. Actually decided I would become an inventor, which means being an entrepreneur, when I was 5. And I remember my parents giving me these enrichment toys, erector sets, and lots of things that had lots of parts in it. And then I would go around the neighborhood and gather things and take them